If you want to edit the questions in a quiz, that's one category. If you want to edit the name, the title, the due dates, the points, all that stuff that goes with the quiz, that's another category. So if I want to change the date, if I want to change the availability period, if I want to change how many attempts they get, all that stuff, that's in edit test options. Again, quizzes, tests, all the same terminology here. And then if I want to change the test questions, I click on edit the test. So that can get a little confusing sometimes. The other stuff here, you probably won't have to do a whole lot with right now if the quizzes are already available and just need to have their dates changed. So let's see what options you can change in quizzes. Now the page I'm viewing here is what all tests, aka quizzes in Blackboard, are going to look like when you get to the options. What you see is what you get editor is a good area to put things like how long the person has on the quiz, how many attempts they have, but they will see that right before they start it. But if you want them to plan ahead, it's probably helpful for that to be in the upfront information. Also, what chapters it's covering, maybe even learning objectives if you want to prepare for Quality Matters rubric. All right, so multiple attempts, you can choose a few things. You could say no multiple attempts, just take it one time and that's all you get. You can select unlimited attempts, or you can specify the number of attempts that the students get. Pretty straightforward. This is all the attempts they get during the time period that it is open and not yet due. Now we do like to, if we're using multiple attempts, we need to make a decision here, and so we try to go with the highest grade, meaning that when the grades for the multiple attempts are all graded, it will only show the student essentially the highest grade as the one that's going to go into their grade book for calculation purposes. So very helpful to do this, otherwise their last grade attempt might be low and they had 100% on the earlier attempt and they won't get credit for it. Force completion and set timer. These I don't use a whole lot for quizzes unless the quiz, for example, I'm trying to use to help students prepare for the time it takes on an exam. So maybe I set it to one question. It gets 1 minute essentially. So I can do that for quizzes if I want to, but we use this primarily for exams. So when you set the timer, you got a few options. So the first option is up here, force completion. If the student opens this, they have to complete it in one setting. If they leave the quiz to close their browser, they disconnect from the internet, it'll submit it and they can't finish that attempt. Now if they have multiple attempts, that's okay, then that attempt submitted early has a low grade, but they still have other attempts they could use. If I have something that they only have one shot to do, again like an exam, I can click this, and so once they exit, it'll automatically submit it and they won't be able to take it again if I don't have multiple attempts. Okay, so that's forced completion. Now, the timer function is pretty useful. Again, useful especially for exams. So the numbers I go by, and check with your course coordinator, your mentor that you're working with to try and get a parameter. But most of us in the full-time pool, we use basically 1 minute per question that is multiple choice, kind of simple matching. If it's a lot of matching, maybe I have to give a little bit more time, and like true-false answers and multiple answers. So anything that's kind of not typed in, I give them 1 minute for. If they have to type in something, whether it's a one-word entry or an essay, I give them 2 minutes to complete that when I calculate the total time. So what I'm going to do is, in my mind, in my process, I'm going to figure out how many minutes total. This isn't per question, this is total. So I'll figure out how many minutes total I have for this exam based on the question types in my calculation. And then I have to decide whether Autosubmit is off or on. When I have the timer set, the student's going to see a bar that's got basically a countdown at the top of every question that they review. So it's essentially the top of the quizzes as they go through. When this is set to Autosubmit off, the student is told that their time is going to expire, but they still could continue taking the quiz or exam. If that's not what you're trying to do, and often setting the timer is not to do that, you'll want to turn on test will save and submit automatically once the timer expires. And they get a warning before this as well. So, and they can, as I mentioned, visually see there's a countdown progress bar, if you will, that's a timer, and it gets closer to the bottom and then the timer goes off. So really think about what you want to do. There is a downside though. There have been instances when I've set this, and because I've set this to auto submit on, when students came to a certain point, it submitted it, but it didn't save some of their answers. So if you're going to use this, I highly recommend that you tell students you have to save each answer as you go. Don't click an answer and move to the next thing and expect to save it at the end. That's good practice anytime they take a quiz or exam, but especially helpful here. Otherwise, they'll lose maybe half their exam since they last saved a question. All right, so display time. I'm going to actually take these off for right now. After the due date, when I set it below here, I'll have the option of not letting students take it after the due date. So for me, the security of it is in my quizzes, I allow them to review their previous attempts. They can't take a new one, but they can look at their quiz questions after the due date has passed. But we don't do that necessarily on exams unless they come in one-on-one to review it with you in office hours. Okay, so I'll show that in just a moment. If I want to set a specific password, I can do that. Useful for exams for sure, because once it comes open, if a student is not following your instructions and you're all in the computer lab and it already opened and you had some stuff you need to tell them before they open it up, then you probably want to click the password so that they'll wait until you give them the password to open it up. If the date is set, let's say this class meets at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, if I've set it to display after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, regardless of what else I do, if I leave the password open, then as soon as it displays, a student can log in and start taking the quiz. And that may not be what you'd like to do, or the test rather. So you can set a password here. Don't worry about a password though if you're going to use Respondus Lockdown Browser, because it will use its own password and it ties in and shows up here for that process. If I want to do exceptions, like I need to change the availability dates for someone, I use this often when someone's missed an exam and they've gone through the appropriate process, so I've granted them a makeup exam on it. I can change when they can view it by changing and adding them or their group to this side here. I don't need to do that right now, and usually I don't do it on quizzes because they're open 24 hours a day until the due date, but it does happen that exams sometimes need exceptions. Okay, here's the due date. Again, it's a little funky thing. You set the due date. That's when you want it to be due and has to be submitted by, and you won't accept stuff after it. So if you just select the due date, let's say I come up here and I select due date, it doesn't automatically select this second choice. So I do need to decide whether or not I want that before I save it. So the due date and time I'll enter here. Let me show you what I was talking about for time. So midnight means the start of the day. And end of day is talking about 11:59. So midnight is the start of a day, whatever date this is. If it says midnight, that's the start of it. If it says end of day, then it's the last part of it. That's usually when we have our stuff due. Most of us will have our assignments and quizzes and stuff due on Sundays. So I'm going to move that to my Sunday, but totally up to how you organize your class. Now, if I set this date and time, and I do not click this button, what ends up happening is the student can still open it if it's viewable. So let's say that I didn't select this. I didn't want to make it unaccessible later. If I didn't select it to close viewing at the due date, and I leave this open, then when the student accesses it, it will say this is a late attempt, but it'll let them complete it, and it could be calculated in the Grade Center. So that may be how you want to handle it. The nice thing, though, that happens is when you go to the Grade Center, as you're looking through the list of scores, if a student has been allowed, meaning you didn't click this button, to take the quiz after the due date, and they did that, all the submissions, let's say that quiz grades all the questions on its own, has no fill in the blank, it's all multiple choice, so you don't have to grade really anything, you just have to review it. Well, all the attempts up to this due date will just auto-grade and they'll be in the gradebook. However, if the student took it late, it's marked as late, and in your gradebook, it shows up as needing grading. Even if the computer already graded it completely, it won't show that to the student because it allows you to go in and say, yes, I'm going to accept this. Oops, I should have pushed that button to not let you. No, I'm not going to accept it. So you have that ability. You would delete the attempt if you're not going to accept it, or give a 0, which won't really impact unless they haven't done anything else before the due date, because if it's a 0 and you have the highest grade set, then their highest grade will override. Now, if I don't want them to be able to start the quiz at all after the due date, I do have to click this button, and it will show not available, so on and so forth. Okay, so we'll say do not allow. We want them to kind of get used to deadlines, right? Self-assessment options, there's a couple different things you can put in here, but the default basically is to include this in the test scores, in the test section of your grade book so that it'll incorporate into their overall grade. If you've got something, though, that doesn't necessarily need to be graded, and you chose not to use the survey function, you can build a survey out of a quiz and then just not include it in calculations. So you have those choices here. Showing test results, that's an important thing to set. There's a couple different theories on this. My personal theory, when Blackboard worked more, I don't know, maybe that's not the word I'll use. When Blackboard was new to me, I kind of turned on all these cool things and realized later that some of those things make my life harder as an instructor and as a student. So when I came to this, there's a couple schools of thought. I originally, in some of my classes I still do this, but originally I set it so that if a student takes a quiz, they submit the quiz and it's still within their due date, right? And they've got a couple other attempts they want to do. When they submitted that quiz, maybe they took it the first week just so they had an attempt on it. That's certainly advisable. And they didn't do well because they hadn't read the chapter yet. That's okay. There's nothing really wrong with that as long as they complete it later. So when they go back to see their quiz results, there's a few things that can happen. One, we can set it so that they don't see any results. That's kind of how we use the settings for our actual exams. So students can't see the right answer, can't go in automatically without you present and copy questions and print it off. For quizzes, though, I generally allow them to do that. So if it's going to be a test, I don't want them to have access to any questions after they've taken it without reviewing with me. Then what I want to do is make sure that I kind of leave it so that there's nothing chosen, and then I unselect all these or whatever. And so at that point, they're not going to see the score per question afterwards. They're not going to see the answers, correct or submitted. They won't see any feedback, and they won't show the incorrect responses. So they don't know what they got right or wrong, and they don't actually see the choices if they do make it into that point. But since this is a quiz, I want them to be able to see some of these things later. So you have a couple options. One school of thought, the one that I previously used, was when the student has opportunities to take the quiz before the due date, and in this case, they were unlimited. So if they had that opportunity before the due date and they submitted their quiz, I wanted them to be able to see what they got right and wrong. However, I wanted to make sure, though, that they had to look up the answer and not just serve that to them. And so that's one school of thought. And so if I wanted to do that, I would like to have a setting here for before due date, could be after submission, could be any of these other things listed here. And then after the quiz is due, I don't allow students to take the quiz. It won't even let them click on it. So at that point, though, I'm okay, since they won't have more attempts, with them seeing the correct answers, the feedback, and all those other things. You can even set it, too, so that before the due date, they see feedback, which is a valuable tool in quizzing. But after the date, I generally turn all of these on. So how would I do that? Let's just pretend that that's what I'm going to do. So I would probably say, let's see, I'm going to select after submission. I will allow them to see all these things, right? That's what all these check marks would be. Let's say, though, after submission before the due date, I want them to look those answers up. Well, then I'm going to show all answers, but I won't show which ones were correct. I'll only show the answers and submitted. If I click all answers off, then they will only see the question, not the answer choices. Okay, so then after the due date, though, I want them to see everything. Come back over here, after due date, and select, and now they'll have two different servings of information, and you use this to the strategy that you think is best. The only thing we really outline, though, is if it is an exam, please make sure that nothing is selected in these lines. And the last set of choices. Test presentation. How do the students see the test? If you have a test that has questions you want served randomly, then you click this button. It may have already been built into the quiz. I'll show you that at some other date when we talk about making quizzes. But this will randomize the questions. If you have something, though, that has questions in a particular order, like they need to answer the first one before they see a particular second one, and you don't want that randomized, just deselect, and it'll be in the exact order that it looks to you when you look at viewing the test, the questions. Also, test presentation, do they get to see as a big, long, scrolling screen like this all of the questions at once? Or do they see one question, they select that question, answer, and then they move to the next question? Mind you, they may not have to save. That's why you need to remind them to save as they go. But this is useful for exams and useful when we're trying to prepare them for things like a National Registry exam, which serves one question at a time. And then finally, I can select prohibit backtracking. This only really works with the one question at a time, but that would mean that they can only move forward. They can't go back and revisit a question in the past. And why would you do that? Well, maybe you had a couple questions in there that they could, through process of elimination, maybe guess a future question or a different question from performing on the other question, or it has a clue in it that you think they could take from it and make answering that question a little too easy for them. Well, you might prohibit backtracking so that they can't go back and review those things. Obviously, they can't review their answers and change them after that point, though, as well. So pluses and minuses, and totally, again, up to how you would like to when you're working through the quizzes. On tests, we generally like to do one at a time, and it's up to you to prohibit backtracking or not. I'm not sure that we have a tendency to lean either way. Just know, though, if the students are preparing for something like a National Registry exam, I don't believe they have the ability to see all the questions at once. Well, they don't. In fact, they can't. But I don't think they can go backtracking either. I think it's one and done. Answer it and move on. So just kind of think about that, because them taking a quiz or an exam is technically also a style of preparation for their registry or licensing and certifications exams. So just taking it and the way that we set the quiz up can train them to do better or have no understanding of what to expect and no practice when they move on to it. So you decide, do you want to give them some practice or not? Totally up to you outside those boundaries. So those are the settings, and then when I hit submit, they've been saved. All right. So it is practice for some instructors, a kind of preference, I think, but trying to make it as clear as possible. You can add the due date visible here if you'd like to in what we call the description. So that's the what you see is what you get editor field that we saw. But let me just show you what they'll see if I don't have that. If they click on the quiz, earlier I was mentioning we could put stuff in that description, due date, how long the quiz is, blah, 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 so they can see it before they click. If you didn't do that, they will still be able to see everything. It's just after they click, right before they start the quiz. So on this page, it's got the information on multiple attempts, due dates. Doesn't really show how things are viewed necessarily to students, but they'll find that out when they review it later. And let's say they click begin, they take their exam quiz, they get through it. If they have an attempt or two already, when they click on this, it will actually list the other attempts. So that's one way that the student can go back and access their quizzes to review. And again, that happens regardless. And so if I have an exam that the student took, if this is still viewable, they'll be able to click on their previous attempt, and that's when they'll be able to potentially see questions that they've answered that you don't want to get out. So we like to set that availability so they can't even get to that point after the due date. For quizzes, though, I think you're probably okay not worrying too much about that. It is a good study tool, in my opinion.